All right, well, thanks a lot, Dean Mummery, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. So let's focus on the first half of my title first, the idea that we have a brain and it's an information processor. And I think this is something that we all have a common sense understanding is true. We're all aware that we're taking in sensory information from our 5 big senses, so touch, taste, sound, sight, smell, and it's going into our brain and it's being processed and it's producing the types of overt behaviors that we observe. But I think what we have a less of an understanding of is the sheer volume of information that's coming into our brain at any given time. And so that's where I want to start my talk. And I was racking my brains with what was going to be the best metaphor to convey the amount of information that's flowing into our brain. And I realized I need look no further than the sort of natural wonders in our back door. So from a remote helicopter in stunning high definition, this is Niagara Falls. So I think you'll all agree with me that that's a pretty awesome spectacle. And what makes it so awesome is the amount of water that's crashing over those falls every given second. And in fact, in that approximately 30 seconds clip, 50 million liters of water will have cascaded over Niagara Falls. And so for a metaphor, let's imagine that those 50 million liters represent all of the information that's coming into your brain in just 1 second. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring into this room right now all of that water that you are actually aware of. So the equivalent amount of water that reaches your awareness. And some of you might be thinking that you're going to get wet. But actually, I can hold in my hand the amount of water that you're actually aware of. And in fact, it's about a half of one of these water bottles. So for the 50 million liters of water that represents all of the information coming into our brain, we're aware of just 250 milliliters, or 1 cup. Now, some of you might be thinking that I'm crazy, that you live in a rich world filled with a lot of information that you're aware of at any given moment. So let me give you a few examples that sort of question some of your limitations. And the first one's a bit of time travel. And here's what I mean by time travel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you a question. And I'm pretty sure you're going to know the answer. But here's the time travel part. After I ask you the question, I want you to consider, did you know the answer to this question before I asked it? So I'm going to ask a question. I figure you're going to know the answer, but did you know the answer before I asked it? And here's the question. What's the approximate angle of your right knee? Now, I'm guessing most of you could give me a report. Maybe you're sitting cross-legged, so it's about 90 degrees. Maybe you're sitting and it's about straight out. But the question is, did you know that information before I asked you that question? And I would argue the answer is no. I would argue that that piece of information, while it was available to your brain, was part of the 50 million liters that was rushing through your brain without reaching conscious awareness. But maybe you need some more examples. So here's another example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a short passage of text inside of that white box. But your job isn't even to read the passage of text. Your job is easier than that. It's simply to count the number of times the letter F appears in the passage of text. Okay, so I'm going to bring up some text that's going in that white box. All you have to do is count the number of times, or the number of times the letter F occurs. Okay, so hopefully everyone had a chance to read through that passage. So now, by show of applause, because it's pretty bright up here and I can't really see hands, by show of applause, who saw exactly 1 F, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so there's actually 6 Fs in that passage. Okay, so I can guarantee you that all of you can see the whole white box. So it's not an issue of this information reaching your retina or reaching your visual cortex, but rather it's an issue of this information not reaching awareness. It's part of the 50 million liters that's crashing through your brain and not quite getting through. And as a last example, has anyone noticed that for the last 2 slides I've been giving a rep talk instead of a per talk? Probably not. And yet this is clearly visible to you on my slides. And yet, of course, it's one of those pieces of information that wasn't terribly relevant to your understanding of what was going on, and it just flowed through the brain. So that's the first half of, sort of the first part of my talk, sort of getting an understanding of the amount of information that is coming into our brain, and yet the sort of limited, small fraction of that that's actually reaching awareness. And the second part is for the second half of my title, which probably is what Dean Mummery was referring to, requires a little bit of explanation. What do I mean when I say motor chauvinism? Well, first I should attribute that phrase to the person who I think invented it, and that's Dr. Daniel Wolpert. Now, Dr. Wolpert's actually given a real TED Talk on this topic called The Real Reason for Brains, and I encourage all of you, if you're interested in what I'm talking about today, to go check out his TED Talk. But his idea of motor chauvinism is quite simple. The idea is that of that 1 cup of water that we get to use, we use it for one purpose only, and that's to guide efficient actions. There's no other reason. Now, let me stop for a minute and explain why I'm okay to be shamelessly ripping off Dr. Wolpert's work. So here's a representation in a stick figure of all of the times that Dr. Wolpert has received a citation for his work. And now I'm going to bring up, in relative scale, the number of citations that I've received. Now, some of you might not have noticed the small speck of dust next to his left foot, but that's me. So let's zoom in a little bit, make so that I can show up. And now there's 2 reasons why I'm okay to be stealing Dr. Wolpert's work. 1, relative to him, I'm basically a flea, so I don't think he's going to care that much. But 2, I get to take advantage of the best part of science. And the best part of science is that we can stand on the shoulder, or in this case, the heads of giants, to make ourselves feel a little bit taller. And with that, I'm going to steal his best example for why he is a motor chauvinist. So this, as Dr. Wolpert calls it, is the humble sea squirt. And the humble sea squirt has a fascinating life cycle. As a juvenile sea squirt, it has a small brain, and it moves around the bottom of the seafloor or along its coral reef, looking for a good place to call home. And once it finds itself a good place to settle down, it really settles down. It locks itself down into place, and it assumes the adult phase of its life cycle, and it doesn't move for the rest of its life. Now, interestingly, the very first thing it does upon assuming its adult life cycle, finding that place it's going to call home, is digest its own brain. So this is Dr. Wolpert's evolutionary example that evolution has shown to us that the brain serves the purpose of guiding movement. And once you don't need to move anymore, you don't need a brain. And in fact, it becomes redundant to the point that it can get digested. So there's a couple of quotes from Dr. Wolpert that I think are particularly enlightening. The first is that we have a brain for one reason and one reason only, and that's to produce adaptable and complex movements. And he goes on to say that you may reason that we have brains to perceive the world or to think, and that's completely wrong. So when the dean asked us to give these PER talks, he also suggested that we check out some reference materials. And specifically, he suggested that we refer to a TED Talk that talks about summarizing a TED Talk in 6 words. And so I challenged myself to summarize Dr. Wolpert's talk in 6 words, and I managed to do it in 5. And that is to say that the brain is for moving. But I feel like it lacked a little bit of something, and I'm never one to not take advantage of my words. And so I added the last to say, the brain is for moving, period. That's all. Now, some of you might be thinking, and you might be thinking I'm a little bit crazy, maybe this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and you would be hoping that those thoughts weren't just being conveyed to me. That is, you're able to lock away some of those thoughts, and they won't influence your actions. But if Dr. Wolpert is right, and the only thing our brain is for is to produce actions, then our actions should have all sorts of information about these hidden cognitive states. And that's really been the primary objective of my research here at the University of Alberta. And I've sort of tried to coin this new phrase, that rather than thinking of action as the result of the thinking that goes on in the brain, it's time to start thinking about action as the observable part of cognition. So instead of action and cognition being separate, action and cognition are one and the same entity. And that's really the primary focus of my laboratory here at the University of Alberta. So I've called it the Action in Complex Environments Laboratory, or ACELAB for short. And I believe that by analyzing human movements in complex worlds, we can infer a lot about what's going on inside of their brains or their mental states. So I'm going to end my talk with a couple of examples from my own research where I think we've succeeded in seeing action as observable cognition. And the first is to explore an example where we have evidence that we saw hidden cognitive states in human movements. And this is attributed, in large part, the motivation for this work came from a hypothesis developed by Dr. Paul Chisick, a University of Montreal researcher. And his hypothesis was that the brain plans more than one movement at a time. So imagine you're sitting at your desk and you've got a coffee mug and you've got the computer mouse, and you don't actually know at any given moment whether or not you're going to reach and click the mouse or reach out for the coffee mug. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, maybe it's most efficient in that case to actually have motor plans ready to go for both of those potential actions, so both the coffee and the click. And when you actually want to execute one of them, you just select the one and it's already available and you execute it. Now, the problem from my perspective as someone who wants to observe overt human behavior is that we only ever actually act on one thing at a time. So if I just look at what you're doing at your desk, I only ever see that you reach out for the coffee cup. I have no evidence just by looking at your movement that you were even ever considering the computer mouse. So I would argue then that this multiple motor plans is a hidden cognitive state. It's something that we think is going on in the brain, but we don't see it visible in action. And that was really the challenge that some researchers and I took on when we developed a paradigm, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. But first, let's take a step back and let's see what was the result that Dr. Chisick got that led him to develop this hypothesis. And it's a really simple experiment. It's conducted by a monkey while they're doing neurophysiological recordings. And the monkey just starts by looking at this fixation cross in the middle of the screen and then is presented with two targets, a red one and a blue one. But the monkey doesn't know which one it's going to have to reach towards to get its reward. So it's kind of thinking, well, maybe I'm going to go to the red one, maybe I'm going to go to the blue one. And then we actually take away the targets from the monkey. So it still knows that it's eventually going to have to reach towards where the blue one was or the red one was, but it still doesn't know specifically which one it's going to go for. And finally, only later do we give the monkey its payoff. We tell them, if you reach towards the red one, you'll get a little bit of juice. And so we give them that cue. And in this case, the monkey would execute the movement towards the red target. So while they're doing this task, Dr. Chisick and colleagues were recording from neurons in dorsal premotor cortex. And dorsal premotor cortex, among other things, will actually encode the direction of an upcoming movement. So if I look across the whole population of cells in dorsal premotor cortex, I can do a really good job of predicting in what direction you're going to reach. And these are the results. So along the x-axis, we've got the activity or the preferred direction of neurons in dorsal premotor cortex. So we can see representations for the reaches to the right and representations for directions towards the left, or red and blue targets. Along the y-axis, we can see how these signals evolve across time. And on the z, or in the height axis, we just see what the response across the population of neurons is. And the first thing I'll draw your attention towards is this period of time where there's no targets on the screen, but the monkey knows that it might have to reach towards the red one and it might have to reach towards the blue one. And what we actually see are two small hills of activity, suggesting that indeed, as Dr. Chisick hypothesized, what we're getting is parallel planning. The monkey is considering and planning movements both towards the red target and towards the blue target. However, if we see what happens later, once the monkey knows where it's going to go, all of the action is with the single target that got selected. And indeed, if we were just to observe the monkey's reaching behavior, we would see no evidence for that parallel motor planning. It would have remained hidden to us. So my colleagues and I developed the following paradigm. What we had is had human participants making rapid reaches towards a touchscreen. And we wanted to maintain the spirit of Dr. Chisick's paradigm. So we had them looking at a fixation cross, and then we brought up two targets on the screen. Now, there's two really important aspects of this paradigm. First, these reaches were incredibly fast. So as soon as these people saw these two targets, as quickly as they could, they had to reach out and touch the target. And the second and most important thing is we didn't tell them which one they were going to have to reach towards until after they started moving. So not until your finger lifted off of that start button did we fill one of the two targets in, and only then were you able to correct to its final target location. By doing so, what we hope to do is preserve this motor plan competition and push it all the way so that it wasn't being resolved until you started your movement. So here are the results from this experiment. I'm going to be showing you an overhead view of how the hand moves through space as it goes towards the touchscreen, which is represented as that dark bar at the top of the plot. And there's two key conditions. There's the condition where there's only one target present, and there's the condition where there's two targets present. And when there's one target present, not surprisingly, participants can rapidly reach out and hit that single target. We're pretty good at pointing at things. But the question is, what happens when there was two targets? What happens when, as Dr. Chisick hypothesized, there would be a competing motor plan? And what we see is a beautiful spatial averaging of the hand moving directly up the middle of the table. Now, this is a behavior that is entirely consistent with two motor plans competing and, as a result, producing an averaged spatial movement. So we would argue that what we've done is designed the right paradigm to show that what we thought was a hidden cognitive state can actually be seen in human actions. Now, some of you might be thinking that this is still a relatively arbitrary task. It's got very fast movements towards pretty meaningless stimuli, just circles on the screen. So let me end by talking about a study where I think we used slightly more meaningful stimuli. So we had people make decisions to choose their favorite treat item among these 4 chips and chocolate bars. Now, I think all of you in the audience would be able to rank these things from your most favorite to your least favorite and everywhere in between. And in fact, that's what we had participants do at the end of the following experiment. Now, in this experiment, we used a slightly different setup. And this is the exact same setup that I've now got up and running here in my ACE lab at the University of Alberta, where we have motion trackers placed around a tabletop, as well as a projector that hangs above the tabletop and shines down onto the surface of the table. In addition, the hand of the individual is being tracked with a reflective marker. And if you combine all 3 pieces of information, you can actually change that whole tabletop into a touch interactive surface. And that's exactly what we did in this experiment with the chips and the chocolate bars. On every trial, we just presented 2 of the treat items and had them reach out and touch whichever one they wanted. Now, unlike my previous experiment, there were no speed constraints. They could take as long as they wanted to reach out and touch the one they liked the most. And we gave them incentive to actually choose the one they liked the most by randomly choosing 2 trials at the end of the experiment and actually physically giving them whatever they chose on those 2 trials. So if you really liked dairy milk and you chose dairy milk every single trial, there was a really good chance that you were going to walk out of the experiment with a dairy milk. So let's look at the data from one sample participant. And for this sample participant, this was their ratings of these items. They just loved the dairy milk, but they also really liked the Lay's potato chips. But at the other end of the spectrum, they really hated the Doritos. And so for this person, we can imagine that there's 2 kinds of decisions. There's hard decisions, and there's easy decisions. And hard decisions are between the dairy milk, which you really like, and the Lay's potato chips, which you like almost as much. So that's a tough decision. But on the flip side, there's the easy decision between the dairy milk, which you love, and the Doritos, which you hate. And that's a no-brainer. You're going to choose the dairy milk every time. But the question for us was, would we be able to see some measure of their behavior, of their preferences for these items in their physical reaching movements? So here are the results from that study. Again, I'm going to be showing you how the hand travels through space from an overhead view. And first, for the easy decision, choosing the dairy milk over the Doritos when it's on the left-hand side of space, and you move straight towards the dairy milk. Again, that's a really easy choice. Same goes when the dairy milk's on the right-hand side of space, you move straight towards it. And we can quantify how directly you're reaching towards these things simply by taking the area between those 2 curves. The easier the decision, the straighter you move, the bigger the area of the curve. The question is, what do the hard decisions look like? And critically, before I bring up the data, I want you to notice that in both of these trials, and in all of the data that I'm showing you right here, people only selected the dairy milk. So if I was just measuring your overt behavior or your explicit choices, these 2 trials would look identical, because at the end of the day, you chose the dairy milk. But even though your choice is identical, how you made that choice is fundamentally different. So on the harder choices, your hand follows a completely different path. It's as though we can see the indecision in the flight of your hand. It's like you're going towards the dairy milk, but you really like the Lay's and you just can't make up your mind. Even though you get to the dairy milk, it's still manifest in your movement. So again, I would argue that this personal preference for treat items, we had no knowledge of what our participants' particular preferences were going to be, and yet we got a whole bunch of information about this inner hidden cognitive state simply by watching how their hand moved through space. So I summarized the first part of my talk, sort of capitalizing on what Dr. Wolpert has already done as saying the brain is for moving. Period. But if we accept this as being true, then we should believe, since the brain is only controlling actions, that the actions should give us much insight into what's going on inside the human brain. So if I have to summarize my own work going forward here at the University of Alberta, I would say, moving is thinking. Everyone sees it. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.